Hey everyone, my name is Razzy, and I've been going through the list of PS Plus games I have saved to my library as part of my indie binge. Initially, I was planning on going through all the independent games that I missed in 2016, but there are so many older, brilliant ones that I still haven't gotten around to. And the first one I completed was this one, The Unfinished Swan. The Unfinished Swan is yet another I'd heard good things about, but never really looked into. I figured this would be the perfect time to talk about it because Giant Sparrow's second game, What Remains of Edith Finch, is just around the corner. Upon opening it, the Unfinished Swan greeted me with a simple but elegantly designed menu and an equally beautiful theme song. This minimalistic presentation is masterfully carried on throughout the entire game, as you might expect. When you're done watching the introduction and actually begin the game, you might think it's a bit too minimalistic. There's just a small dot at the center of the nearly blindingly white screen. Anyone who's played a first-person shooter knows what that means. Guns. Actually, it means paint. The Unfinished Swan has you, a recently orphaned young boy called Monroe, pursuing a swan which has disappeared from one of his mother's unfinished paintings by venturing through what remains of an old castle and the lands surrounding it. For the opening, you reveal the castle by spewing black paint everywhere. Throughout this 2 to 3 hour long story, this simple mechanic of shooting liquid is explored in a couple very interesting ways. Later, shadows and other colors are introduced and the land has more definition, but you have to navigate it by spreading vines with water. Soon after that, you're given the ability to build your own blocks that you can use to get to higher ground, still utilizing the technique of shooting blobs in order to determine sizes. There are a couple smaller ways in which the game varies things up a bit with regards to gameplay, and none of them have time to get stale or repetitive because the game is the perfect length. Speaking of the game's length, the whole of The Unfinished Swan is structured like a bedtime storybook. It's one of the few games that comes to mind that I feel can be played by children just for the story. It's so wonderfully abstract and expressive. Things kind of just happen in the game, but that's usually how children dream up their own stories while playing with toys or, more fittingly, drawing. Kids don't care about the intricacies of writing realistically developed characters and backstories. They don't care about pacing. They just want to know what happens next. And anything can happen next, because a child's imagination knows no bounds. That doesn't mean that The Unfinished Swan is something that older audiences won't enjoy. This isn't the kind of mindless entertainment you can stick your kid in front of if you just want a moment of downtime. I think that anyone with half a brain, regardless of their age, will be able to appreciate just how well-crafted and intelligent this game really is. Furthermore, I do feel like there is definitely some more obscure and metaphorical meaning behind it. It has some darker and more mature undertones in the written story, at least with regards to my interpretation of The Unfinished Swan. It's a charming little tale about greed, overcoming the fear of the unknown, and generally being able to move on. Although those themes are already obscure and somewhat difficult to uncover, I think that it can definitely be argued that The Unfinished Swan is more about pure expression. At the risk of sounding too pretentious, you're an artist inadvertently lobbing paint at a blank canvas to see what it reveals to you. The idea that things can just happen without much thought or the stress of being constrained by the constant need for structure that we adopt as we grow up. Actually, one of the only real limits with regards to the gameplay, at least at the beginning of the game, is you have to be careful that you don't cover too much of the world up. If you do that, you won't be able to see how to progress. So I guess you can argue that, in a way, part of The Unfinished Swan is about haphazardly forging a messy but distinct path in a specific direction, inevitably heading closer towards the game's conclusion. You can't do everything. Many games tell you you can define your journey and truly impact the world around you, and I think the Unfinished Swan is actually quite similar in some ways, because you're literally leaving a mark on the world as you progress through it, and at certain points you can look back to see your work and how, on multiple levels, each paint lob has helped you actually define the world you're playing in. Okay, maybe I'm going a bit too far down the rabbit hole, so let's back up a bit and let me talk about some of the other things that I really like about the Unfinished Swan. For starters, I love the art style. The illustrations in the cutscenes are beautiful, but I'm talking more about the 3D world you navigate and the manner in which Giant Sparrow uses minimalistic art direction in the Unfinished Swan. The very few distinct colors are used to guide you to your next destination, along with the swan's occasional yellow footprints. But there's not only a minor use of color, the game also doesn't have any terribly complex shapes, and obviously there are barely any textures. Instead, it lets you provide the necessary detail yourself by shading objects with scattered paint blobs. I constantly found myself turning around at a vantage point to see the bigger picture, and I was surprised to see how much care had been put into the structure of the levels and their scenery when the chances are you could miss a great deal of it. But a lot of the game is spent in more defined environments, where you can already make out all of the necessary structures from the start. But, like I said earlier, the expressive nature of hurling blobs is carried on throughout the rest of the game in one way or another. I'm really impressed by how much control you have over these vines. There are restrictions, they can't grow past cracks, but regardless, watching them sprout at your command is incredibly satisfying, and being able to climb them afterwards is even more so. Further down the line, when you're estimating the sizes of blocks as you construct them, you do so effortlessly and smoothly that, like everything else, it never feels terribly calculated and taxing. This sensation of tranquility is amplified even more by the soundtrack. It's utterly heartwarming and inspiring. I felt like I could do anything when I was listening just to the opening theme of the game. The sound effects further reinforce the idea of being in a place devoid of so much distinct sensory information by echoing or just generally reverberating in such an ethereal fashion. Especially at the start of the game, sound effects actually help guide you quite a bit because they help define certain things you're hitting. For example, somewhere at the beginning of the game, I didn't know exactly where I was, obviously, and I didn't know what was surrounding me, but I did know that there was water nearby because I just randomly decided to lob some paint somewhere, and the splash sound that it made was an unfamiliar one. It didn't sound like the typical paint sound, and as a result, my imagination ran wild with ideas of what exactly was surrounding me and where I was positioned in this world. Moving on to the details, I also like how the game goes about telling its more obvious narrative. As you walk around the world, you might find a random letter hanging on a wall. If you shoot it, it reveals some backstory about the world and your journey through it, with wonderful writing delivered by some lovely voice acting. There are differently colored balloons littered around the world that you can collect by shooting. These balloons are like the game's currency, and you can use them to purchase various toys that can add something minor to the gameplay. Each chapter has a specific amount of balloons, and you can see how much of them you've acquired under the level select. This adds a level of replay value to the game that I didn't think it needed, but nonetheless which is a welcome addition because I think children are more likely to play The Unfinished Swan and experience its charming story more than once, and the collectibles might make the experience even more compelling for them. So when it comes to looking for flaws with The Unfinished Swan, that's where things can get a little tricky, because this game is so unique and different, and there's not much to compare it to. And on top of that, it's obviously a very abstract experience, as I've already explained. But if you were to force me to look for an issue with the game, if you were to force me to nitpick something, I guess I could argue that that whole idea of this immediate sense of expression can sometimes carry on over to the manner in which the game world was constructed, which sounds obvious, but just hear me out. I do definitely feel like most things in this game were placed with a distinct sense of purpose and with extreme attention to detail. But I do think it can be argued that levels might seem cobbled together with some really basic geometry and assets that don't always mesh well aesthetically. Personally, I think that kind of suits it thematically, but I can see how some people might be turned off by that. But you have to remember that this game was initially released in 2012, which was a time where indie games with sizable budgets weren't as much of a regular occurrence. Other than that, it's very difficult to find something that might be considered a definite flaw, because everything about The Unfinished Swan is so obscure anyway. I think a lot of issues might just arise from personal preference and taste. So yeah, those are my thoughts on The Unfinished Swan. Yet another great indie game that I can cross off my bucket list. And I'm so glad that I managed to cover it before the release of Giant Sparrow's second game, What Remains of Edith Finch, which is a game that I'm a lot more interested in now that I've played The Unfinished Swan, and I definitely intend on covering that game as soon as possible. But yeah, so I hope you enjoyed this video, I hope you enjoy your day, and I will see you all in the next one.